Hello and good afternoon, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to our first in a series of webinars discussing housing issues and property rights in 2023. These webinars are brought to you by the Small Property Owners Association, also known as SPOA. My name is Amir Shahsavari. I'm the Vice President of SPOA. I'm happy to be moderating these webinars again. And for our first episode this year, I'm thrilled to introduce an esteemed group of panelists who know a lot about housing. We have Mr. Greg Vassell, who is the President and CEO of the Greater Boston Real Estate Board. He's respected by many far and wide. This is also his first time as a guest panelist with us, so we're thrilled to have him. Greg, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Amir.
Great to have you. We also have Ms. Kate Franco, who is the chairman of the board at GREB, and she's also the Vice President of Claremont Companies. We've heard wonderful things about you, Kate. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Amir. Glad to be here.
And we have Miss Allison Drescher, who is the president of SPOA. Allison and I came to SPOA in 2020. During that year, we were both elected to leadership positions. I'm proud to call her my friend, and I'm proud to say that we've worked closely to advance property rights and sensible housing policies for the last 3 years. Allison, thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for doing this, Amir.
My pleasure. And we have Mr. Demetrios Salpoglou, who is the CEO of Boston PADS. He is a dedicated SPOA member, and he's a wonderful advocate in the realm of housing issues and property rights. We thank you for being here, Demetrios.
Thanks for having me.
And I also want to say a special thank you to Mr. Lucas Krolak. You're not going to see him, but he's handling all the technical aspects of this production behind the scenes. So Lucas, we thank you for all that you do. Before we start our conversation about rent control, I just want to speak briefly about SPOA and who we are. We are a big tent organization. We have different property owners who have different types of properties, but we also make a point of championing the rights of the small mom and pop owners because they do provide over 60% of the rental housing in Boston and throughout Massachusetts. And those small mom and pop owners are also more vulnerable to dreadful policy proposals like rent control and other policies that we will be discussing today and during future webinars. So as a background, what do we do? And why do we face these negative stereotypes as if we're all greedy people trying to take advantage of our tenants? That could be farther from the truth. We do provide a great, valuable service to our communities. We provide tenants with safe, maintained places that they can call home. We put our savings on the line to do that, and we provide work for countless other businesses and industries. SPOA did get started in 1987. It was started by a group of mom and pop owners who tried to repeal rent control. Eventually, they did that. They succeeded in putting it on the ballot. It was defeated in 1994. And the problems that owners faced were several. Historically, we know that rent control stunted the production of housing. We know that it made it more difficult for owners to collect their hard-earned rental income. We know that it led to existing housing stock falling into disrepair. And we know that it made it more difficult for owners to remove non-compliant tenants from their properties, not only to the detriment of the owners and their buildings, but also to the detriment of the many good tenants who relied on their landlords to provide them with safe, maintained places that they could call home. So here we're faced with a challenging situation. Rents are going up. Tenants are having difficulty affording higher rents. At the same time, there are many property owners who have rising expenses to deal with in many categories. insurance, property taxes, mortgage, electric, plumbing, countless other expenses that we don't hear about. And we don't really hear that other side of the equation. And while we do strive to provide tenants with affordable housing and decent housing, our job at SPOA is to make people aware of the challenges that we face as well. And so Mayor Wu has proposed a newer version of rent control. It's been branded as rent stabilization. She also calls it rent control 2.0. She has insisted that this version is a moderate version. It's a harmless version. But we're going to have a conversation about that today, and we're going to see how accurate those claims are. And before proceeding, I just want to remind people to please donate to SPOA. You can go to our website, www.spoa.com/join, and make a donation. We would appreciate it if you could make a regular monthly donation, either $100, $500, or whatever that you can afford, because we are a group of volunteers. We do take time outside of our day jobs and running our businesses to provide advocacy for you. It's our pleasure to do it, but we do need your help. So if you could please donate at spoa.com/join, we would greatly appreciate it. And with that, I just want to have each of you make a brief introduction. And the question I'm going to ask you is, how did you get into real estate? Greg, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Amir, and thank you for having me on the program today. I got into real estate about just over 20 years ago. I was a practicing attorney, and I had practiced in the environmental area for a number of years. But I also had an interest in real estate, and especially real estate on the business side. So I was able to get a job with an organization where I could work for them on legal and environmental issues, and they were actually, it was a group called Mass Development, and they were actually working on a lot of redevelopment projects of state assets that really didn't cash flow. So what we would do is work on them to the point where we could get private developers involved and incentive to get in and take the projects over. And that's sort of how I ended up sort of getting into real estate and then coming over to Greb. And then sort of like the second half of my career was born.
Thank you very much. How about you, Kate?
Thank you, Amir. I started my career in real estate in the early 1980s. I really wanted a career that was fulfilling all my needs, to be involved in finance, development, management, and also to be doing something that mattered. And real estate was perfect. What matters more than providing new homes or new apartments for people? It was a really feel-good kind of career. And unlike Greg, I stuck with it, stood with it, matured with it, have had the opportunity of doing it in all parts of this beautiful country of ours. And I'm really happy now at the end of my career, as I think of retirement, to be back here in Massachusetts, where I was born and raised my family. It's just such an amazing career, and you touch on so many different facets. You never have a day being bored when you're in real estate, whether it's in development, finance, or management. And that's what attracted me and kept me in it all these years. But thank you for asking.
That's wonderful. That is wonderful to hear. We appreciate that. How about you, Allison?
I've actually always been around real estate, and my father was building a business when I was in about the second grade. And I actually remember being a young kid. I was probably about my son's age now, but he had just bought this larger complex, and he assembled all of us, and we were having an open house for the tenants, the prospective tenants coming in during the weekend, and we were all dressed up, and so it really was a family thing. And I always find it strange when people comment that they would never want to work 24/7, because that just always was the way it was. And it's something that I really enjoyed doing as I got older, and branched off and did some things myself. And Also, I will say that one thing, even though we've had our struggles since the pandemic, it has been really gratifying to come together with a community of people in the business. It can be a pretty isolating, you don't always know a lot of landlords. And one real benefit I think SPOA has done for a lot of us is kind of put us all together, which has been a great experience for me.
And for me too, I appreciate that. How about you, Demetrios?
Well, somewhat similar to Allison. I was talking with my father. I just, graduated college down in American University in Washington, D.C. And we were talking about different career paths. And he's like, son, I really like real estate, and I think you should explore it. So I was like, that sounds like a great idea. Just graduated college, walked into an office, got hired over in Alston. And so that's pretty much been my career path now for the past 30 years, is real estate and technology combined. And I would probably echo a lot of the sentiments that Kathleen said. Every day is different in real estate. You learn something new every day. You're constantly growing, whether you're developing a property, renovating a property, learning about the latest market trends. It's so fascinating if you have an inquisitive mind, because there's so many things you can do in real estate. So even as I approach 30 years of a combined effort of primarily real estate and technology, there's always something new every single day that jazzes me, that I want to dig into and optimize. And I just love real estate entirely.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I feel the same way about it. It's very rewarding. It gives you the opportunity to be creative when you provide others with places to live. My mother was in the business, and from the time I was a kid, I was helping her out, and she had a very personal touch with her tenants. She was their friend. They would always come to thank her. They would always compliment her to say, well, we thank you for everything that you do. We love living here in such and such place. And so I inherited that, and I love that. I think that's really the ultimate reward, when you can do something for people and when they can thank you for it. However, we do know that the service that we provide has become more expensive. And I'm just wondering, how did we get here? Why are costs going up? If anybody wants to take that, I'll open the floor.
I'm happy to talk about one of
Go ahead.
landlords. So I just met with the developer. We were hanging out the other day. He built a project in Methuen, and this was beginning at the pre-pandemic, finishing in the pandemic. Cost per square foot new construction, GC by himself, $245 a square foot. Same contractors, same people, go build something almost identical, different town, but post-pandemic, $400 a square foot. So we're looking at, and everything's the same, essentially, the blueprint, the format. So what we're looking at is dramatically increased costs. And the construction industry is facing it, I think, at a huge, unprecedented level because of inflationary pressures right now, coupled with construction costs and high energy costs and labor shortages. It's a confluence of many, many things that are driving those prices much higher. And so I think that there's a misconception out there, and it's easy to misconceive that, where you say, well, look, most people can't see the rising construction costs. But building constructions is an incredibly energy intensive endeavor. And when you look at that in all those confluences, I think that's what we're seeing right now, is prices going up. And to match that, you need to have prices that are higher in terms of rents, just to sustain the affordability or the viability of a project. And I think that's why we're seeing the viability of projects going down.
Right. And with regard to that confluence that you described, we do have a statistic that says that for every $1 paid in rent, only 9 cents goes to the property owner. The rest of it goes to expenses. We have a graphic that actually shows a dollar sign that's cut into different pieces to show how much of that dollar actually goes towards expenses relative to what the property owner takes home. And so on that note, when you talk to property owners, have they voiced frustration to you about the rising costs of maintenance, repair, and everything else?
Yeah, they have. And a recent one that I'm hearing about, which I haven't heard a lot about before, is that insurance prices are going through the roof. And so I think that also factors in, because it's another bundle of sticks, to your point, when you're doing these net operating income formulas, well, if your insurance goes up by 30%, someone has to offset that. So there's a lot of these moving pillars or parts that are causing rents to rise just to keep landlords viable.
Right. And on that note, we've also heard that a lot of business owners are leaving Massachusetts in large numbers. I don't know, Allison, do you have any input as to why that might be happening?
I think that we are facing some headwinds in the state of Massachusetts. I think to piggyback on what Demetrios said, I mean, you're looking at cost increases of 45% for construction, you're looking at interest rate increases, you're looking at the insurance industry. The insurance industry is also pulling out of large markets in Florida and in California. So we just have all of these disruptions given the post-COVID economy. And I think the state were in somewhat of a panic a little bit as to how to deal with this. And I feel like there's a disconnect between the business community and the legislators on the state level, certainly in the city of Boston, about what the realities are that we're facing that are making production really complicated to build more housing. And their response is somewhat stunted and maybe was realistic in the pre-COVID economy, but is absolutely a killer in the post-COVID economy. And I speak with people regularly in the business community, not just in real estate, but in all capacities. And just in the general conversations I have with people, at least once a day, somebody is explaining to me their exit strategy. They're explaining to me how they're moving to their summer house on Lake Winnipesaukee. They're moving to Florida. They're thinking about the Carolinas. And those discussions are increasing in frequency. So the hope is that we can reset and get this reality, which is very much an open discussion amongst anybody with a business, any type of business, and the people legislating on the city level and the state level, as to where that disconnect is, because it's wide.
Another important fact I find, Allison, too, is not only are we dealing with these rising costs of supplies, utilities, insurance, but the rising cost of labor and the difficulty in finding labor. There is such a strenuous challenge to get a really strong labor force out there. And when you do now, it's a much higher cost than what we were looking at pre-pandemic. And that's impacting a lot of industries, especially construction, as well as just normal mom and pop operating industries. And it affects us in our rents in our apartment complexes as well. If we don't have laborers working, we don't have people in our community. And that's really been another force that's been impacting all the rentals and the construction costs as well.
And, you know, Amir, one of the things I think that we should touch on a little bit is the fact that when you look at why have rents risen? We've got all these other associated costs that have gone up, but we just haven't produced enough. You know, and there's such a demand, and it's simple supply and demand economics. And when you don't have enough units, there's going to be less vacancy, so the rents are going to be higher. And everyone struggles with that. I mean, you know, large owners, small owners, I'm sure everybody really wishes that we had more because, you know, the market is what it is. And it's hard for people that are, you know, the residents that are looking for places to live in Boston if they want to stay here.
What are the barriers, in your opinion, to the supply issue? Why is it that it just takes too long to build more housing, or are zoning requirements getting in the way?
Well, I think when you look at what it takes to build a project, you've got hard costs, soft costs, and land costs, right? So the land costs, if you're going to build in the city of Boston, are going to be high just because they're not making any new land anymore. We're not refilling the Back Bay anytime soon, right? So our costs are only going to escalate there. When you look at our soft costs, some of our regulatory burdens that we've put on development, including zoning, make it harder. we've got right now, if you go to try to build something, you've got a huge public process that you have to go through. Well, if you want to make it even more engaged with the public, it's only going to increase that cost. So you're going in the wrong direction. You won't be driving down the cost of housing. You're going to only be increasing it. And, the hard costs, basically, we're sort of held hostage to what's going on in the world, interest rates and inflation. So that we sort of have to ride the storm out, and just like everybody else in the world is. But if we overregulate ourselves, that's going to drive our costs as well.
I see. And this question is for both you and Kate. I know that Greb has done its share of advocacy on this issue with elected officials and others. How receptive and how understanding have they been about this whole process and the challenges that we face?
I believe that they are listening, Amir. I think that there's a lot of complex issues out there. I think they're listening to all sides of the discussion. I mean, we've seen movement with MBTA communities. There's talk now with the budgets about doing more, with housing development incentives and tax credits. And I think that they're really trying to look at how do we solve this problem, but recognizing it that it's not going to be one quick fix. It's going to take a million little things and a few big things to really make a dent in this. And, we have been up on the Hill and we have been speaking to the legislature, and we really feel that they are hearing. There's still work to be done, a lot of education to be done on what some of the more consequential effects are of some of the policies that are being discussed. But I believe they're open and receptive to listening. Greg, would you agree?
I totally agree, Kate. And I think sort of, Kate hit it right on the mark. And I also think there's a real struggle politically within elected officials on what do we want to be in Massachusetts? Do we want to move further to the left? Are we going to be California? Or are we going to be more sort of a state that was sort of socially responsible, providing, a safety net for people, but stressed more working in businesses? And I think there's a real struggle that's going on now. Where are we going to be politically with our future? And we sort of see it a little bit with our congressional delegation, especially. We have some that lean extremely far left, and we have others that are sort of the old school Democrats. So, I think I think it's manifesting itself at the governor's level. We're seeing, an administration that seems to be coming in with a centrist view as opposed to an extremely progressive view. And that will manifest itself in economic policies and especially in housing policies.
Well said. Demetrios, I'm going to get to you in a minute, but I just wanted to ask Allison, given that SPOA has spoken to elected officials in the process of our advocacy, how do you think that's gone overall? Do you think that they're getting the message?
I think that there are some real positives. I think they're getting more willing to talk to us, take meetings with us. I think, and let's be clear, this is all on the state level. I would echo what Greg has said too. I think the messages coming out of the governor's office are very positive and very realistic about what it takes to keep a business going in Massachusetts and the value of the business community. I would say the reps and the people on the House side from Massachusetts, I think have been, and most of the people we've talked to, they've been infinitely reasonable, interested in having a dialogue. And I do even see people who may not necessarily agree with us be willing to talk to us about the issue. We may not always agree on the solutions, but I think the dialogue is helpful. I have to say, what I see coming out of the city of Boston is pretty discouraging. I see a real reluctance to engage in dialogue, to open the process to all stakeholders, a reticence to really sort of listen to any voices that aren't internally in the administration. And what I worry about for Boston is a lot of the impacts that we're talking about, we're not going to see for half a decade. I mean, we will see immediate things, i.e. tax day on April 15th. I think of last month, they were $2.2 billion under what they expected in terms of revenue collection in the state. But a lot of the impacts that we're talking about on a city level, they're going to take a long time for people to see. And the city has done well for a long time. And it really does have some potentially adverse impacts for Boston, which Boston's a wonderful city and a wonderful place to live. So I think we should all be hopeful, but in all honesty, I'm not overly optimistic because the dialogue has not been robust.
Amir, can I throw out one thing about what Allison said?
Certainly.
I think Boston is really at the precipice right now of what's going to be happening, because when you look at Boston's commercial market, their office buildings, their values are going to fall just because people aren't coming back to work and companies are going to be taking less space. That's going to result in an awful lot less money for the city to function and pay for, police, fire, schools, emergency services. So Boston has to be really careful because, yes, Boston has been the strongest and the largest, but they also have the most to lose because people have really gravitated more to the suburbs and closer to their homes as a result of this pandemic. So the city needs to be real careful.
Right. And it also goes back to a point that Allison made before. So goes Boston, so goes the rest of the state. But, we were talking to an elected official who represents a part of Boston, and he was saying that when it comes to creating affordable housing, the burden seems to always fall on Boston as opposed to surrounding cities. And I'll turn it over to Demetrios. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, if you look at housing production and permits, I think it's already in the cards. I mean, numbers don't lie. I always say, liars never figure and figures never lie, right? And if you look at the general direction of what's happening right now in terms of housing production, I mean, the writing's on the wall. And so that's the first thing. Then we look at the commercial sector. What can we retrofit out of this commercial stock, which will probably not come back if we're all being honest. I think that the pandemic accelerated a process that I think was slowly happening. It just supercharged it, right? So then the question becomes, how many of these buildings are viable to move back into the residential sector and at what cost? Now, there may be some government incentives there or tax benefits or tax breaks to retrofit those, but I think this is a technology and also a lifestyle change that was coming. It's now at a bigger platform. So tax revenues are going to go down as a result of that. That's just a mathematical fact. And, speaking with, a lot of property owners that own buildings in downtown Boston, they're suffering vacancies. They're asking for abatements. They're trying to sell their prices at a lower price. The writing's on the wall there. The math's there. So we are an incredible city with a lot of very, vibrant, smart thinkers. So I think we got to get ahead of this instead of being reactionary, be proactive, and we can work through it. As far as like cost production, I mean, you looked at that. I think it was the Globe article the other day, and it was like $36,000 a student in Massachusetts. I think we can do better on cost in general and delivery of goods and services at a more affordable and more effective rate. And I think that some of those things are going to have to start happening, especially if our commercial sector starts to go down in terms of tax money that ends up in the coffers of the state. So there's a lot there to unpack, but I think we can, if we're a proactive state, and I think we are, and we're a proactive city, and I think we are, and we do the right policies, I think we can move and get ahead of this.
Well said. And we can and we will talk about alternative solutions to solve the housing dilemma. But this is also a good segue into rent control and Mayor Wu's version of it. And Demetrios, I'll give the first question to you, and I'm going to pull your chain a little bit here because I know what you're going to say. Isn't it true that government builds the best housing in the world?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we all know, as we've driven, all across the country and looked at different, government housing projects or housing endeavors, that they're not something that everyone wants, right? And government's just not good at housing. It never has been. It never will be. And then I think, to extrapolate that and say, well, let's try rent control, which is another government policy. that's a long walk. I mean, it used to be, so we would have these discussions, right? And I think they're broad-based. Does rent control work, right? And then you say, well, show me a shining example of it. Well, I just spent 3 hours on Google looking for a positive example of rent control. I can't find one. And so I think that's an issue. And then, it's not just a US based issue. If you actually research the rent control issue, it hasn't worked in Canada. It hasn't worked in France. It hasn't worked in other countries. So what are we doing here? Why are we even talking about it? And I think that there is no appetite on the state legislature level. And I think Allison, illustrated that. It almost seems like we have more supply and demand legislators in the House and maybe in the governor's office that are looking at it as just a simple math equation. And what do we do to make that better? It's almost like saying, are the adults in the room here making sure that we've got everything right? So I think that's the broader issue of rent control. Does it work? The answer is no. Has it worked anywhere? The answer is no. So I'll hand it back to you.
No, I appreciate that. And we know that in St. Paul, Minnesota, there was tremendous blowback against rent control after they passed it. I think the mayor said, oh my God, what did I do? Because everybody migrated over to Minneapolis, I think, and the production of housing went down quite sharply. I had a figure, I don't remember what the percentage is, but we also know that in Oregon, the first state that passed it on a statewide level back in 2019, we know that the rental cap has gone up to 14 or 15%, and now people are just re-questioning everything. When it comes to the Boston proposal, would someone like to describe it? We know that Mayor Wu said, oh, well, it's a 10% cap, and that's all there is to it. But I think there's more to it behind that. I'll open this up to anyone who wants to take it. What are the dangers with this Boston rent control proposal?
I wouldn't mind just stabbing at it quickly from a mathematical perspective, right? If, eggs went up by 80% and gas went up by 45% and construction went up by 35%, I don't think there's anything that's gone up in the single digits in terms of inflation and because of energy costs and, all higher interest rates, everything's gone up. So to cap something at 10% when the rest of the market is moving at a much higher pace, just in and of itself doesn't make sense. And then couple that with targeting a specific group instead of the entire state paying for it, that kind of doesn't make sense. And it seems somewhat, putting on a very small group of people to handle a bigger statewide issue that can be solved with proactive policies. So I think that, if you step back and look at it just alone, if you were like, well, let's keep it at, 30%, okay, you're in line with some, not that I agree with any wage and price controls, I don't, but I think 30 would be a better answer than 10%. I mean, as it stands, a lot of these landlords are still recovering from the pandemic. Remember, we had the highest vacancy rates in the city in recorded history when everybody left. We had the greatest migration of people outside of this city when the pandemic came. We had record high vacancy rates, record high availability rates, and landlords took that time. They renovated their properties. They put a lot of money in. They did a lot of stuff that they couldn't do otherwise because they had such a low turnover rate. So they put the money in. They did a lot of incentives. They paid a lot of broker fees. They let people move in at lower prices, and they're just catching up from that, recovering from that. Because remember, I think to Allison's point, properties are looked at over the long term. You're depreciating things over longer periods of time, 20, 30, 40 years, et cetera, on certain life use items inside a property. And so, you build rent control, but what happens over time is you put rent control in place or anything like that, you don't see that right away. But 5-10 years, you're going to see that because landlords will cut back. They'll try to save money and costs and everything. And that's just your downward spiral of bad housing. And what I think that does ultimately is it when younger people, vibrant people are looking to live in the city of Boston, they're just going to say, you know what, I'm going to move south where they're building stuff like crazy, like gangbusters. And I think we all do it. We all get different brokerage alerts for different cities that we like to look at and see. And you see new construction. So you're seeing different cities building brand new stuff and we're not. And I think that also speaks to our younger crowd and our vibrant crowd, which we really want here to be the future generation that drives innovation in our cities.
You have said before that one of your chief concerns is the whole idea of the future employees migrating to greener pastures, maybe southern states low tax states, but I appreciate your input. I think, Allison, you wanted to say something?
I think obviously also there are other parts of the rent control policy that are quite draconian. It's a 4-page document that perhaps we can attach somewhere here, and people can read it for themselves. It includes a rental registry. It includes the creation of a rent control board, which is another city department, it would appear. And there were a lot of things in that ushering in a whole new definition of eviction, this sort of amorphous just cause eviction. So it was sort of heralded as a rent control bill with a 10% cap, which, by the way, I don't know. I think many landlords, I don't want to speak for other people, but would not find that terribly objectionable. It was more the creation of a whole other layer of control and bureaucracy that comes with what the actual proposal is, which I actually am surprised how little coverage that's gotten in the media and discussion. But also, not to digress into another topic, but one thing that is also going to impact Boston in the long run is, despite the fact we may not all agree on what is exactly happening, investment is turning away from Boston. Real estate investment is turning away from Boston because of some of the challenges in the economics and the zoning and the process and all of this. But we are also sending out exactly the wrong signals in terms of making it all more complicated. But once, as a city, that all of the engines that fuel the real estate business, and once you become sort of known as a city where you're not going to build, that can be very potentially harmful and have real economic consequences in the long run. And when you kind of figure that out from a leadership perspective, it's like turning around an ocean liner. So we started out talking about people moving and their businesses moving, but also capital is mobile, and people with deep pockets, be they REITs, institutional investors, family investors, the only people who can really build successfully right now are people who have really deep pockets. And once you turn that spigot off, how do you turn it back on?
Right. Well said. Very well said. And I know I do have the document that you're talking about in front of me. I'm not going to read the whole thing line by line, but there is a section, I think, under one of the earlier sections. It says that people who own owner-occupied buildings of 6 units or less are exempt. And that always frustrates me, because those people are a significant minority of property owners, even among the mom and pop owners. So that doesn't really help a whole lot of us. But if we go into the issue of just cause evictions, on the surface, I mean, they set out all of these provisions. They say, okay, well, you can evict, you can remove a tenant if the tenant has failed to pay the rent. You can also do that if the tenant has violated an obligation or covenant of the lease. It also talks about tenants who are causing a nuisance, quote unquote, if they are violating other terms and conditions of their leases, or if they are, if they're conducting illegal activities in their apartments. So it lays all of that out. But is it fair to say that in the process of doing that, the burden of proof on the owner to show that the tenants are actually doing all this, does that burden increase to the point where it becomes difficult to actually evict someone? And I'll open that to anyone who wants to take it.
Yeah, Amir, it's interesting because what you'd be doing here in the city of Boston would be creating a separate eviction law from the rest of the Commonwealth. So you'd have housing court that would have Boston's eviction law and the rest of Suffolk County, which would be utter chaos. And if you'll permit me, I think Demetrios is best answering this question. So under just cause, under the mayor's proposal, Demetrios, a landlord doesn't have to renew a lease, right? Typically in any lease that goes on. But what do you think Boston would be like on September 1st if, under her proposal, where tenants don't have to leave when their lease has not been renewed, and you've got new people coming in. What do you think the streets of the city would be like?
The first word that comes to my mind is lawsuits. The second one is lawsuits, and the third one is lawsuits. And everyone would be suing each other. The landlord would be getting sued by the tenant that's in there and the tenant trying to move in. And then there's hotel costs, absolute chaos. Then never mind the footprint of extra traffic and they're trying to relocate people. Chaos, parents coming, can't move in, fights. It's nonsensical in nature. I think that we have to realize that a lot of the policies that are well-meaning are not well thought out. In other words, they mean well, but they're not well thought out because they don't take the next step to look at the aftermath of what could happen. And that's absolute chaos in the city, especially on our moving day like that. But in any event, I think that what we have to do is get back to what's generally right and what's generally wrong. And, and landlords are good judges of character, and they know who pays rent and who doesn't and who causes problems and who doesn't. And having that, the small landlords are particularly acute and are particularly aware of their landlord tenant issues and relationships. And they keep those in very good working order, like making sure that they show up before September 1st to talk to their tenants and make sure that they're ready to move out properly so that the next people are ready to move in. And so a lot of landlords are doing a lot of good things behind the scenes. They don't need a lot of extra legislation. It just gets in the way. They're doing it on their own. So I think that to be long-winded about it, we don't need any more policies. What we just need is to let landlords do their jobs and do them correctly and let, good move forward and continue to do things so that Boston moves along, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. I also wanted to ask Kate what her opinion is.
I totally agree, Demetrios. Everything on the tide is going the wrong way. We want to build more housing. We want people to stay. We want people to invest. But yet every day there's some new regulation being, suggested, being discussed that's going to restrict rights, make it more difficult to develop, make it more difficult to have a thriving business here. Why are you going to build a multi-million-dollar apartment complex here when you know that in a certain amount of time it's going to become rent controlled and you're going to have to sell it at a value that's less than what it could truly be worth because your rents are regulated? Why would you want to do that? Why would you want to have lifetime tenancy and not even have control of your own property for people who no longer really need the benefit of it, people who are overhoused? There's all these unintended consequences. Mm-hmm. And I think people aren't taking the time to really think through what will happen 5, 10, 15 years from now based on what we're doing today. I think it's almost like just a knee-jerk reaction. What's a fast, quick thing we can do? And I can check it off my list to say, yep, I worked on getting more housing, or yes, I worked on more affordability. And I think that it would be a serious detriment going down the road in the future, and it would hurt more than help.
And it is scary to think that, I think in New York, which passed the most severe version of rent control recently, I'm not sure if they actually passed this or if the tenant activists are still in the process of trying to. But when it comes to an owner not being able to, or when it comes to denying the owner the right to not renew a lease, especially in cases where the owner might want to put a relative of his or hers into the apartment or do whatever it is whatever they want because it is their property. The idea that you would be forbidden from doing that while the tenant would have every right to renew a lease forever, regardless of how the tenant actually behaves. I mean, what do you call that? At that point, do you really have a contract with someone? Do you really have a lease, or are you just really giving your property away?
It truly feels at that point like you are giving away your property, you're giving away your rights. It's just so unfair. And when you look at that, over 60% of the housing stock out here predates 1980. You're going to limit what the profits can be on that, what you can make for rent, who's going to live in those properties. Those properties are going to start to become ill-maintained or not maintained. You're going to start making second guesses about being proactive on investment and being more reactive to when you have to fix something. it's almost like a doomsday prophecy from a landlord's position. It's like, here you are on good faith, you're going to do this wonderful thing and do this wonderful business, and then all your rights will be taken away. And then it becomes government controlled housing.
And I think Demetrios can jump in on that issue again. When it comes to what we saw in the past with rent control and what it did to buildings, what it did to neighborhoods, what do you remember from that era?
Well, I hear it from landlords that are older than me. They're a great source of wealth, it's describing their experiences and their problems with rent control. And Kathleen brought up an interesting in one that was recently brought to my attention. I had a landlord telling me about the misallocation of efficiency and operational efficiency, essentially, of the people that lived in rent control outlived their usefulness of the apartment. So they had a family in there, but then they empty nested. And now you have two people living in a 4-bedroom apartment that's being misallocated. And there are studies, I believe, in New York and other states about this, north of 20%. So if those are accurate, and I haven't had time to research them, full disclosure, you're talking 1 in 5 apartments that is not effectively utilized. Now, we already have a housing crisis here. And to add a 20% inefficiency, essentially a tax to it, doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up. And so I think that's another thing. I think government tries to mean well, but it's not a drive-by, feel good thing. You have to really break these things down issue by issue and look at them very, very deeply and see what the consequences and the impacts are. And I don't see any of them that are positive on the side of rent control. I haven't seen one yet. I haven't seen an argument that's been delivered in discourse that would say it's going to provide a benefit and it's going to increase options. I think just the opposite happens. It increases discrimination. It increases the pickiness of a landlord to pick a certain group or pick the highest qualified candidate for the apartment. Whereas when you have more supply, you can be, as a landlord, when you have a lot more supply, people can absorb that. Maybe they had a 700 credit score and they're like, okay, I'll take them now. 650s, I'll take them. Because when you have, here's what I know during the pandemic, landlords were taking a lot more tenants at much lower credit scores, et cetera, and then just like, let's fill it, right? And so when you have a lot of supply, it can apply to a much broader base of people that can rent as quickly as possible and fill those places at lower price points, if that makes sense to everybody.
No, it does make sense. And I know that it also caused further problems where wealthier tenants benefited more than those who weren't so wealthy. It also forced a lot of tenants to stay in place where they were, regardless of the condition of the building, which created a big turnover problem, right? People were more likely to stay in place. Therefore, if you were a tenant looking for a place to live, your options would be more scarce.
Yep. That and I, you talk to people and they say some people were just keeping their city apartment to go and visit and party. They would just pay the low rent and then they'd let their friends go there and they'd live somewhere else, but they still kept their rent controlled apartment. And so you hear all the stories. The best people to talk to are the landlords that actually went through rent control. And I don't think that they have been given a voice at the table to describe a lot of the things that happened to them during that period. It didn't work, and that's why we repealed it.
Right. And you were talking about, you were talking about the rent control fires before we move on. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was a study done in Massachusetts, and I believe it said that there was 700% more fires during the period of rent control, and that wouldn't surprise me, right? And I think that that's because of the fact that landlords couldn't put money into their properties, and so when you can't put money into your electricals, just think through the process. If a landlord doesn't have enough money to put back into the property, health and safety are going to suffer. That's just the bottom line.
And I wonder a lot of the time when we think about these issues, so small landlords provide 68% of the housing in the city of Boston. How are we going to provide this housing? Because with policies like this, what's going to happen, you're going to take a percentage of that housing offline, which is going to give you less housing. you're also going to see a lot of money come due. A lot of landlords, big and small, they refinance, they use the downtime during the COVID pandemic to refinance to get the best interest rates they could. On a commercial loan, some of the loan are up to 5 years. So you're going to see this massive amount of money in the industry that has to refinance at higher interest rates coming up in the next couple of years. So that's going to have a further drag on people in the business. So I think that there's this sort of knee-jerk reaction on the part of the legislators of, we have a problem, how are we going to fix it? But instead of making real changes, an example, which we hear from our constituents regularly, there are over 100 housing agencies providing vouchers to Section 8 tenants in the state of Massachusetts. We have landlords in Boston that are being told to leave units vacant for up to 4 months because they can't get an inspector through the apartments. So here you have a unit that would be available for a tenant on a Section 8 or on a voucher. You have a landlord willing to rent to a subsidized tenant, and the bureaucratic process is asking the property owner to leave the unit empty for 1/3 of a year. I think we've got to try to work to solve the problem together, but unless I don't see a big appetite on behalf of the municipalities to undertake building massive housing projects or apartment complexes for people. So if either the government needs to either say, this is how we're going to solve the problem, we're going to create a lot of new construction, we recognize that's part of our role here, or we need to work to streamline solutions so that they also fiscally make sense. Amir and I had a discussion with somebody about some of the eviction protections or even the legal representation of people. If we have tenants who owe a month or 2 months rent, wouldn't it make more responsible use of taxpayer dollars to pay the month or 2 rent, as opposed to getting into a public defender or somebody, which is much more. I think we're moving in a direction where the government is going to need to directly supply aid to tenants. And it would be very good for us to be part of that discussion. And I don't know how we make that happen, but that sort of seems to be the direction that we're going in.
That's a very good point, and I wanted to turn it back to Greg. Do you have any comments to make?
Well, I think we need to really take a look at, our programs like RAFT and subsidy. And I also think we really need to take a look at some of our affordable housing programs and produce housing at different income levels so that we can get people out of, if they're at the lowest economic rung, give them incentives. I mean, as everyone on the call has mentioned, it's hard to get workers today. There are jobs out there. People have the ability to work. But a lot of those people that are in affordable units are afraid if they make too much money, they'll lose their housing. Mm-hmm. We need to be able to give them something to aspire to so that they can move out of that level of housing and go up to the next level. And I think as a society, we really haven't done a good job at that. We had somebody that used to be an employee at the real estate board, and they wanted to move in with their significant other and a child, but their significant other would lose her apartment, because it'd be too much income that would be coming in, yet they wanted to raise their child together, as parents. And it was frustrating because the rules don't make a whole lot of sense. I think we need to take a look at some of these 60s and 70s era rules and change them and modernize them for the world that we live in today.
And on that note, we have heard people talk about temporary solutions like building ADUs, expanding basements, attics. I came across an article about something that they're doing in the city of Newton, where in response to what the state representative that we spoke to said about the burden falling on Boston too much, he was talking about how other communities have to step up. I think this article suggested that the city of Newton was prepared to create more space for affordable housing by building up. And that is controversial in Newton because, you know, Newton has a certain character where it's a series of 13 villages really that are connected into one big or bigger city. And so there's a little bit of resistance to building up because it changes the look of the city. But beyond that, we might have NIMBYism at work. And so does anyone want to touch upon that issue?
I think, as Greg said, we need housing at all different levels, right? Communities. If you go back to what the communities of the 50s and the 60s were, we were mixed communities. It wasn't like this was a community just for poor people, this was just for moderate. Everyone lived together among each other, and I think that's really what makes a community an enriched community. And I think it comes to education, really educating the general public on what is really happening and what it really means, and what this kind of housing can do, and the consequences of it, how it can improve the community, how it can improve local business, how it can bring richness to that area. I think there's just a lot of education that needs to go on with the general public to truly understand. I don't think people truly understand some of the issues, like rent control. I don't think the general public understands it. If you just said to someone in a Lowe's or a Home Depot, what do you think about rent control? Oh, to restrict rents, that's good, because they don't know anything else about it. So I really think there needs to be awareness campaigns about how building more housing, different kinds of housing, can really enrich a community. And let's face it, any change is difficult for anyone, especially some of the older established communities. But they have to know what the good effects of this can be, instead of just that immediate, no, I don't want you to change my community. No, not in my backyard.
Thank you. Well said.
I agree with what Greg said. I think we do have to look at successful programs. I think the raft was the most successful during the pandemic, and maybe we can build off of those successes, but almost turning to a program like raft to help people. Because I agree and echo Greg's frustration too. If you deal with Section 8 tenants, you know, it creates this whole fear that they're going to lose their housing assistance if their life gets better. And that's not really helping people improve their lives. So I agree. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about exactly the terms within the business, but also looking at short-term solutions as opposed to, we need to come up with different solutions than the ones that are on the table.
Certainly,
yeah. Get anybody to listen to us.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true. Very true. We were also talking about a potential idea, and you know, this is just an idea. Landlords have different opinions about this. We haven't really fleshed it out, but when it comes to giving owners incentives, would anybody favor an idea or an approach where owners and government could pool resources to help tenants on their pathway to home ownership somehow? Pros and cons, anybody for, anyone against? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Amir, I think that makes absolute sense, because especially in communities of color today, one of the greatest disparities is many people in those communities have never been able to build equity. So if we can get those folks on the path to home ownership, they can build equity and have some generational wealth in their families, which will be really good. And within that process, there's an educational process about owning real estate. And then they'll be able to understand some of the things that we deal with on the rent control side, because they could potentially be dealing with it in their own lives. And then it makes a lot of sense and a lot of difference when somebody's actually in it and they see it and it's part of their business.
And how do you think we could convince, if property owners agree, I don't know if they do, but how do you think that could be marketed to the property owner community?
Well, I think you need government involved, and I think you need government willing to do something with their property taxes. So maybe it's a portion of some kind of a tax rebate back into a fund that allows for home ownership for folks. You know, government has to be at the table for this, and they can't constantly be looking for a new tax and a new funding source. they've got to be able to be willing to give a little bit here too, I think.
Right, and the system has to be more efficient. I know when they were talking about making Chapter 257 permanent, and I think they did, we were calling for, in the process of talking about RAFT or talking about a more efficient program, we were talking about needs-based rental aid programs where government would give the rental money directly to the property owner instead of using tenants as the intermediaries. And so I think efficiency is a big part of the conversation, because too many times we hear stories about tenants who, by the time the money comes into their hand, it doesn't ultimately go to the owner because it ends up getting spent on something else. And that's why we've also advocated for rent escrow. I don't know where that is right now. We'll find out soon enough. But I also want to talk about something else that involves you, Greg. I think, and I give you a lot of credit for this, on the issue of eviction ceiling. I know that you had negotiations with Senator Lydia Edwards and you came up with a compromise. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that and what the policy proposal looks like now?
Sure, and I absolutely have to credit Kate with this too, because Kate was chair of our Government Affairs Committee for a couple of years before she was involved in GREB leadership, and she's been involved for so long in real estate and thinking outside the box and sort of looking at issues from a different way. We sort of, as a group, looked at this issue and thought to ourselves, okay, you got to be very careful when you seal records of any way, shape, or form. But we're looking at what's happened on the criminal side with Corey reform. And so if it's okay to do it on the criminal side, is there something to be able to give people a second chance, when it comes to the rental world? The bill that had been originally filed by Senator Edwards was a dangerous bill because there was, they would allow for sealing like practically right away for some of the, the most serious criminal violations. So we rolled up our sleeves. We worked very hard with her for a couple of weeks last year as that bill was popped into the economic development bill to come up with something that could potentially work for owners, as well for tenants. The bill never actually made it because of everything else that happened on the fiscal side with that economic development bill. But it's back again this year. She's filed it as a standalone bill. There's a very similar bill that's also been filed by Majority Leader Moran in the House. And we testified in favor because it makes sense. I mean, sometimes people forget that owners and tenants have a symbiotic relationship. We both need each other. And owners want to have tenants that they can work with. Biggest problem during the pandemic was having tenants that would go silent on you because you couldn't reach out to them. You couldn't find out what was going on in their lives. So I think the more we work together with the other side, I think we can sort of solve some of the problems we're facing.
Thank you for that. Kate, do you have anything to add?
I'd just like to say, landlords and property owners have such a reputation these days, right, of being just money hungry and so anti-tenant. And that's just not true. As Greg said, we need tenants. Tenants need us. We wanted to really support this bill because there are a lot of good tenants out there. And unfortunately, they have had some impacts from COVID, like we've all had in our personal life. And this was a bill that at the end of the day, we got to a place where we felt it was a win-win for landlords and for good tenants. And again, it took being able to be at the table, not to agree on everything, but to understand each other's position and come up with the best policy that really served everyone's needs. So kudos to Greg and the whole team and Lydia Edwards as well for really having the foresight to listen and say, we can make something that's workable if we work together.
That was a really positive indicator, and I think an example of seeing both sides come together. So I think as an industry, we need to work to make more compromises and build more relationships and partnerships with people in the legislature to sort of get some of these new and different ideas out there. We do have a lot of life experience. Also in every lease, the landlord basically has an obligation to provide quiet enjoyment or, to our tenants. So some of these problems are going to begin to impact us when the laws interfere with us being able to carry out the transactional duty that we have to a tenant and at least to our other tenants. So I think that's a good example of this is all sort of symbiotic. So once you tinker with one thing, it's going to have ripple down impacts to other people. And I think that we need to have some discussions. And when I read a lot of the comment sections about not that we should live or die by commenters in the newspaper, but it's discouraging to me, because when people are writing articles that say, people are going to leave the state and the tax rolls are going to go down and you're going to have less money to do that, I think that it is discouraging, because there's a lot of good go and we won't miss you and there will have more housing available to other people at lower cost. That is also, I think, an example of educating, but that's not really solving problems. And I'm a little dismayed, not that that's particularly relevant, but to see the lack of understanding about the positives that the business community and commercial tax dollars bring to the bottom line of allowing both the city and the state to operate. And we have not yet moved to housing as a human right, being the law of the land. But I think there's some people who think that we're there and we're not there quite yet. So I think that's going to create a little bit of static in the business, or for those of us left in it, in states that are going to go extremely far left.
On that note, Allison, when you think about your experience testifying in housing hearings, and when you hear people say housing is a human right, what does that mean to you? How do you feel when you hear that term? What does it mean for a business owner?
Well, I mean, I'm gonna defer to what one of our SPOA members says. If you are an American, you have every right to advocate for that form of government. That is part of the freedom of being a citizen. But what's happening is that isn't the law we are currently in a capitalistic based system. So I think we're in a strange moment in history where there are a lot of vocal people who would like the system to be different, but the way they're going to try to enact that change is by pressuring business owners like ourselves in order to achieve it. So, I mean, that's I hope a rational way to see it, but I defer to other people.
I'm going to defer to Demetrios in a second. I think Winston Churchill once said, referring to this general philosophy, that it's the equivalent of enforcing shared misery upon the masses. Demetrios, do you want to take that?
Well, I think Winston Churchill was a smart man. But, I'm going to switch subjects a little bit and just talk about supply, right? And if we step back and we look at it, right, the greatest driver of affordability is supply, hands down, bar none, right? So if we're misallocating just a little bit, 1 or 2 degrees off on our thought process of where we should devote our time, effort, energy, and resources, then we're going to get the results that we don't necessarily want, right? And so I think that the greatest solution to the affordability crisis, whether that's sales, whether that, purchasing of properties and or rentals, really revolves around supply. And we know we've been undersupplied for quite some time. So we do need to work on innovative strategies for that. Now, I'm all for tax incentives to do that. And, and I believe all housing is good. I think all the way from affordable housing to luxury housing, all housing is good. The more, the better, because if there's an empty place, it's depreciating in its value, right? So that an investor, a landlord, a property owner want that place filled and the mortgage and taxes and insurance, et cetera, paid. That's the bottom line. And so we have to come together as a group, work with legislators, city officials, everybody to work on supply. And there's a lot of things that we could actually do. There are hundreds of plots that the city of Boston owns that are sitting there fallow. They're not optimized. We could rezone zoning throughout the city of Boston, increase height. I don't think many people have an issue with increased height in Boston. We live in a city with a lot of tall buildings, and there's tons of old triple deckers everywhere. Now, with some zoning changes, we could add height from 3 stories to 6 stories all across, literally almost across all the city of Boston, and you wouldn't even notice it. Greater Boston and the suburbs to some degree, the surrounding cities. And if that's too much, make it 4. But what we do know is that we're not optimizing and being smart about what we have in existing footprints. Now, Greg's right, land costs are not going to go down, far from it, but the city's sitting on a lot of land. And then what happens is they go through this slow, laborious process of finally getting it to market, and it's done, and it's aggregated to too small a few players, which also creates, to some degree, I think, a lack of competition. And I think that it should be open and transparent on a board where any developer could bid on it, open bid, it's open 90 days, let the highest bidder win, the city gets the most money, and they can put that to work and resources to help developers. So I think that there's innovative ways you could approach it. It's just having the courage to do it and say, let's tackle it through a series of supply incentives. And so I don't know who we need to get in the room, but I'd love to get everybody in the room, and I'd love to work on that. And I think if we did that, we would see rent prices come down. Now, maybe there's a flip side to it. Maybe a lot of people don't want rent prices to come down. Maybe a lot of people don't want these, the price of properties to come down. Maybe we're looking at it wrong. Maybe there are entrenched powers that don't want those prices to come down. But I know for my personal belief, I'd like to see rents come down. I'd like to see property prices come down through the increasing of supply. And if we do that, Boston wins as a city, and the state of Massachusetts wins as a city long term. So let's stop losing 110,000 people. Let's make it so that we're increasing, like these other states, at 110,000 people, or we have to reverse that direction. I think that's that. And so I think that's government's role, is to really work on what we have and tackle it in an immediate manner.
Amir, can I throw this out? This picks up a point, right, that Demetrios just made. The mayor's proposal, when the National Apartment Association took a look at the mayor's proposal for us and came up with the following bullet points. The mayor's proposal would cost the city of Boston 739 apartments a year if it was put into place. It would result in $262 million in decreased property values, and it would result in the direct loss of $2.3 million in revenue. So I think it hits exactly what Demetrios said. Can we really afford to lose 739 apartment units a year?
We can't. And also the people and the brain trust that leaves with it. If you're discouraging the smartest, sharpest, brightest future people we have to keep the city going for the next 20, 30, 40 years, long after, our productivity has slowed down, I think it's a bad mistake. So I think we really have to do, get that production going. By all means necessary. And I think you'll also attract people from out of state. If you have the most proactive development incentive zones in Massachusetts, people will come from Rhode Island, they'll come from Connecticut, they'll come from New Hampshire, they'll come from Maine, they'll come from Vermont, they'll come from all around because they want to do business here, not the other way. And it's going the wrong direction. And I think that anybody can see that. We're losing plumbers, electricians, handymen. We're losing people that are leaving the state that have intellectual brain trust of developing things for such a long period of time. You lose those people, that's a long walk to get new people developed into that system that have that expertise. And I'm worried about that as well. And that's slower construction, less quality construction. All of it's bad. So government has a role, and I think it's to incentivize everybody in the construction industry and developers to get things done as quickly as possible.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We will move on to closing statements, and then I'll have a couple of closing remarks myself. Greg, you want to go first?
I would just like to say thank you for having me on the program this afternoon. It's been a wonderful opportunity. Amir, I really enjoy working with you, Allison, and Demetrios. It's always fun. It's always a lively and spirited conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Kate?
I want to echo everything Greg said. And as I had said, I believe it's all about educating people to understand the issue. So this has been a great opportunity to really put some different views out there and to provide that education. So thank you again for the opportunity to be here today and for the content of this programming.
And we look forward to working together to continue that education. Thank you very much, Kate. Allison?
Thank you, everyone, for giving of your time today. I know everybody's busy, and to our moderator extraordinaire. And let's hope that Boston is able to avoid the fate of some of our other neighbors in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Portland and Chicago and New York City. So let's hope that we can inspire some positive thinking and different path taking, which allows us to keep moving in another direction. But thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Allison. Demetrios?
Well, I want to thank everyone. It's an extraordinary panel, and I feel very lucky to be around such a talented group of individuals. As far as rent control goes, it's never worked. We tried it here. The results were not stunning. There was a reason why we repealed it. If we look at our housing stock after rent control, it got much better, and we delivered a much greater quality of housing to our city of Boston. Why should we put that in peril right now? And I think that being disruptive through a government policy that hasn't had any success nationally is highly questionable at best. So I think that if we step back and we look at adding supply and, looking at that seriously and working with, city, state officials, everyone, we can deliver great housing to the city of Boston at an affordable price where supply is increased and prices come down and everyone benefits. And I think that's where we need to spend our attention. And hopefully for the remainder of this year, we can look at and deliver innovative solutions rather than some people just saying, well, they're saying no to it. We're not. We're saying, let's focus on aggressively building more properties so that everyone benefits in our Commonwealth.
Thank you, Demetrios. I want to thank all of you. I also want to thank Lucas again for all his help. I want to remind our audience to please donate to the Small Property Owners Association. Again, it's www.spoa.com/join. And we thank you for joining us today. We will be back, and we hope that all of you will be back with us to talk about these issues further. We will also send out an email containing the document outlining Mayor Wu's proposal in more specifics. And with that, I wish you all a good day. Thank you very much.